I was 29 when my family held their annual Anderson Family Investment Trust meeting. It was a tradition going back 3 generations. The men of the family gathered in my grandfather's study to discuss stock portfolios, market strategies, and wealth preservation. Dad, Uncle Bob, Uncle Tom, my older brother Marcus, and my cousin Derek. 5 men in expensive suits discussing money they'd mostly inherited. I was invited as a courtesy. The only woman in the room, relegated to the chair by the window, expected to observe and learn from the professionals. "Market's been volatile," Dad had announced, settling into Grandpa's leather chair like it was a throne. "But Anderson money stays strong. That's what separates us from amateur investors. Discipline, strategy, professional management." Uncle Bob had nodded. "Exactly. We don't panic sell like retail investors. We think generationally." I'd sat quietly sipping coffee, watching them pontificate about markets I'd been studying since college. They had no idea that while they'd been inheriting wealth and paying expensive money managers, I'd been building something entirely different. My name is Riley Anderson. I grew up watching my father and uncles treat investing like an exclusive club. They'd inherited the Anderson Family Investment Trust, a $40 million portfolio started by my great-grandfather, and spent most family gatherings discussing how brilliantly they were managing it. Except they weren't managing it. They were paying Wellington Investment Management a 1.5% annual fee to manage it for them while they pretended to make decisions. The women in the family weren't included in investment discussions. "Too complex," Dad would say. "Requires a certain analytical mindset." My mother managed household accounts. My aunts handled charitable contributions. But the real money? That was men's business. I'd learned early that questioning this arrangement was pointless. At 16, I'd asked why women couldn't join the trust. Dad had patted my head. "Sweetheart, investing isn't really a woman's strength. You're better with creative things. Leave the financial strategy to us." So I'd stopped asking. Instead, I'd started learning. I'd read every investing book in Dad's library, most of which looked pristine and unread despite his claims of expertise. I'd taken economics courses in high school, majored in finance at college. Nice practical degree for a woman, Dad had approved, thinking I'd become a bank teller. Instead, I'd started trading. I'd begun with $3,000 from summer jobs, opening a brokerage account my senior year of college. Small positions at first, learning through mistakes, studying patterns. I discovered I had an intuition for market movements, a patience for research that my father and uncles lacked. By 23, I'd turned that $3,000 into $45,000. By 25, I had $280,000. I'd worked as a financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm, living modestly, investing aggressively. I'd caught the growth stock wave early, sold before corrections, reinvested strategically. While my family paid Wellington Management to underperform the S&P 500, I was beating it by 6 percentage points annually. By 27, my portfolio was worth $1.8 million. And then I discovered something interesting about the Anderson Family Investment Trust. The trust was structured as a limited partnership with transferable shares. Dad owned 35%, Uncle Bob owned 30%, Uncle Tom owned 20%, Marcus owned 10%, and Derek owned 5%. They thought those percentages were fixed, locked in by family tradition. But limited partnership shares could be sold, transferred, or gifted, with proper documentation. I'd started asking questions. Casual questions at family dinners. "Uncle Tom, how's your portfolio performing?" "Marcus, are you happy with Wellington's returns?" "Derek, do you ever think about managing your own investments?" The answers had been revealing. Uncle Tom was frustrated with underperformance. Marcus thought the 1.5% management fee was excessive. Derek didn't even look at his statements anymore. So I'd made them offers. Private, quiet offers. "Uncle Tom, I'll buy your 20% stake in the trust for $8.5 million. That's above market value for your share." He'd been skeptical until I'd shown him my own portfolio returns. 28% annually over 5 years. Compared to Wellington's 12%. Then he'd been interested. "Why do you want it?" "Because I can manage it better than Wellington. And I think it's time someone in this family actually understood investing instead of just inheriting it." One by one I'd approached them. Marcus had been easy, he'd wanted capital for a business venture and didn't care about the trust. Derek had never been interested in investing anyway. Uncle Tom had seen my track record and made a calculated decision. Within 18 months, I'd acquired 65% of the Anderson Family Investment Trust. I'd spent $22 million total, leveraging my portfolio, taking calculated risks, using option strategies. But I'd done it. I controlled the family trust. And neither Dad nor Uncle Bob had any idea because the transactions were structured through legal entities and processed quietly through the trust's administrative framework. The trust documents required annual shareholder meetings, but voting was by percentage ownership. With 65%, I had absolute control. I could fire Wellington management. I could restructure investments. I could make every decision. I just hadn't told anyone yet. That was 2 years ago. Since then, I'd been quietly managing the trust through proxies and legal representatives, attending the annual meetings as the observer, watching Dad and Uncle Bob congratulate themselves on performance I was actually directing. I'd fired Wellington management 16 months ago and brought everything in-house, managing it myself through a registered investment advisor structure. The family's 1.5% annual fee disappeared. Returns improved from 12% to 23% annually. The trust grew from $40 million to $68 million. And Dad still thought Wellington was managing it. This year's meeting was in December, held at Dad's house instead of Grandpa's study. 6 people around the dining table. Dad, Uncle Bob, Uncle Tom, Marcus, Derek, and me. Dad had printed agendas like he was running a corporate board meeting. "Let's begin," Dad had announced. Wellington's Q4 report shows strong performance. We're up 14% for the year. We were actually up 26%, but Wellington's final report, sent before I'd fired them, had shown 14%. Dad was still reading old documents. "Excellent management," Uncle Bob had agreed. "This is why we pay professionals. They understand market complexities that amateurs never grasp." I bit my lip to keep from laughing. "Riley," Dad had said, noticing my expression. "Something amusing?" "No, Dad. Just listening. You should be taking notes. This is valuable education. Maybe someday you'll understand enough to manage your own savings account." He'd smiled condescendingly. "Though probably best to stick with index funds. Stock picking isn't for everyone." "I have some stocks," I'd said mildly. Marcus had snorted. "What, like Apple and Google? That's not real investing, Riley. That's just buying popular names." "I'm sure Riley does her best," Uncle Bob had added. "But there's a difference between dabbling and actual wealth management. The Anderson Trust requires sophisticated strategies. Hedging, sector rotation, international diversification. It's complex. Very complex," Dad had agreed. "Which is why we trust Wellington. They have analysts, researchers, professional traders. Not something a single person can replicate." I'd remained quiet, sipping my coffee. "Actually," Derek had spoken up, "I've been meaning to mention, I sold my shares in the trust last year. To Riley." The room had frozen. "You what?" Dad's voice was sharp. "I sold my 5% stake to Riley. She offered above market value and I wanted capital for other investments. It's in the trust documents from last year's filing." Dad had turned to Uncle Tom. "Tom, you didn't." "I sold my 20% to Riley 18 months ago," Uncle Tom had said calmly. "Better offer than keeping it and paying Wellington's fees." "Marcus." Dad's voice had risen. My brother had shrugged. 10%, yeah. Sold it to Riley for my restaurant venture. She paid cash, no complaints." Dad had turned to me slowly, his face reddening. "You bought their shares?" "Yes." "How much do you own?" 65% of the Anderson Family Investment Trust." The silence was absolute. Uncle Bob had found his voice first. "That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. Tom's stake alone would cost over $8 million. "I spent $22 million total," I'd said calmly. "For 65% ownership. It's all documented in the trust filings. I'm surprised you never reviewed them. Where did you get $22 million? Dad had demanded. "I earned it. I've been investing since college. Started with $3,000, built it to $1.8 million by 27, leveraged that into the capital needed to acquire majority control of the trust." "That's not possible," Uncle Bob had repeated. "You work as a financial analyst. That's a middle-income job. You can't have. I worked as an analyst, I'd corrected. Past tense. I left 2 years ago to manage investments full-time. My personal portfolio is currently worth about $12 million. The trust is worth $68 million, of which I own 65%. So my stake is about $44 million. Combined net worth approximately $56 million. Dad had been shaking his head. The trust is worth $40 million. You're reading old numbers. The trust was worth $40 million 2 years ago when you were paying Wellington their fees. It's now worth $68 million because I fired Wellington, cut the management fees, and improved the investment strategy. We're up 26% this year, not the 14% you think. You fired Wellington? Uncle Bob's voice had been strangled. You can't just fire our wealth management firm. I can actually. As majority owner. I fired them 16 months ago and restructured everything. The returns speak for themselves. We've outperformed Wellington's projections by 12 percentage points. Dad had stood up abruptly, pacing. This is insane. You don't have the expertise. I have more expertise than Wellington's analysts who were churning our portfolio for commissions. I have more expertise than a family that inherited wealth and paid others to manage it while pretending they understood markets. And I definitely have more expertise than men who just told me to stick to my savings account. This is why women shouldn't, Uncle Bob had started. Shouldn't what? I cut him off. Shouldn't learn about investing? Shouldn't build wealth independently? Shouldn't question male authority about money? I own 65% of this trust, Uncle Bob. I control it. My vote is the only one that matters. There had been a knock at the door. Dad's housekeeper had opened it to reveal Martin Caldwell, the director from Wellington Investment Management. Martin? Dad had said desperately. Thank God. There's been a misunderstanding. Riley thinks she fired Wellington, but obviously. Actually, Mr. Anderson, Martin had interrupted, his expression uncomfortable. Ms. Anderson did terminate our management contract 16 months ago. I'm here because you called asking about Q4 reports, and I needed to clarify that we haven't managed the trust since August 2 years ago. The room had gone completely silent. That's impossible, Dad had said weakly. I've been receiving quarterly reports. From my registered investment advisor, I'd supplied. I took over management and continued sending reports to maintain transparency. You apparently never noticed they were from a different firm. Martin had pulled out a document. The termination was properly executed by Ms. Anderson as majority shareholder. She has full authority to make management decisions for the trust. Wellington no longer has any relationship with the Anderson Family Investment Trust. But the returns, the 14%, Dad had stammered. Those were Wellington's final projections before termination, Martin had said. We have no knowledge of actual performance since then. 26%, I'd said. We returned 26% this year. The trust has grown from $40 million to $68 million in 18 months. Better returns, zero management fees, and actual expertise instead of cookie-cutter portfolio management. Uncle Bob had sunk into his chair. You've been managing $40 million. $68 million now. Yes. And doing it better than the professionals you insisted were necessary. Dad had been staring at Martin. How is this legal? How can she just take control? She purchased shares legally from willing sellers, Martin had explained. The trust documents allow share transfers. She now owns 65%. That makes her the controlling partner with full decision-making authority. Everything was done by the book. But Dad had stopped himself. A woman. I'd finished. Stat. I'm a woman who owns and manages a $68 million investment portfolio. The same woman you told to stick to savings accounts. The same woman you excluded from investment discussions because it was men's business. Turns out I'm better at men's business than the men. Martin had excused himself quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama. After he'd left, the room had remained silent for a long moment. Finally, Uncle Tom had spoken. For what it's worth, Riley, I don't regret selling to you. My shares value has increased 30% since you took over. That's better than Wellington ever did. Thank you, Uncle Tom. I don't regret it either, Derek had added. You've been sending me detailed reports. Actual analysis, not generic market commentary. I've learned more about investing from your quarterly letters than I ever did from Wellington's boilerplate statements. Marcus had nodded. Same. The restaurant used your capital well, and watching how you manage the trust has been educational. You're good at this, Riley. Dad had been standing by the window, his back to us. I don't understand. When did you learn all this? How did I not know? You didn't know because you never asked. You assumed I was incapable because I'm a woman. You excluded me from investment conversations, so I educated myself. You told me to stick to savings accounts, so I built a multi-million-dollar portfolio privately. You created the conditions for this by underestimating me for 30 years. I was trying to protect you. From what? From wealth? From financial independence? From proving I'm smarter than the men who inherited everything and managed nothing. I'd stood up facing him. You weren't protecting me, Dad. You were protecting your ego. The idea that your daughter might be better at this than you was threatening, so you dismissed it before it could be proven. Well, now it's proven. Uncle Bob had been reviewing documents on his tablet, his face growing paler. The portfolio composition is completely different. You've restructured everything. Yes. Wellington had you in overpriced mutual funds with high expense ratios. I moved to index funds and direct stock positions. Lower costs, better returns, more control. These tech positions are risky. They're up 40%. Meanwhile, Wellington had you overweight in low-growth value stocks that barely kept pace with inflation. This concentration in growth sectors could lead to volatility. It already has. I managed through 2 corrections, selling into strength and buying back during weakness. That's called active management. That's called actually paying attention instead of just collecting statements. Dad had turned back around. What happens now? Now we vote on trust management, I'd said. As majority shareholder, I'm proposing that Anderson Family Investment Trust continue under my management with the current strategy. All in favor? Uncle Tom, Derek, and Marcus had raised their hands immediately. That's 65% voting yes, I'd said. Motion passes. I'll continue managing the trust, sending quarterly reports, and hopefully continuing to outperform the professionals you insisted were necessary. And if we want to sell our remaining shares? Uncle Bob had asked stiffly. I'll buy them at fair market value. Your 35% combined is worth about $24 million at current valuation. If you want out, I'll raise the capital and consolidate full ownership. Dad had exchanged a look with Uncle Bob. Some silent communication passing between them. We'll think about it, Dad had said finally. Take your time. Either way, I'm managing the trust. The only question is whether you want to benefit from my management or cash out. The meeting had ended awkwardly. Dad hadn't said goodbye. Uncle Bob had left quickly. But Uncle Tom, Derek, and Marcus had stayed, asking questions about specific investments, wanting to understand my strategy. You really built 12 million from 3,000? Marcus had asked. Over 11 years, yes. Compound returns, disciplined investing, continuous learning. Nothing magic about it except patience and actually understanding what I was buying. Could you teach me? Derek had asked. Actually teach me, not just send reports? Of course. Over the next few weeks, the story had spread through the extended family. The women had been particularly interested. My mother had called, pride evident in her voice. I always knew you were smart. I just didn't realize you were this smart. My aunts had wanted lunch meetings to discuss their own finances. My female cousins had asked about investing courses. The idea that a woman in the family had built this kind of wealth and expertise had shifted something fundamental in their thinking. Dad had finally called 6 weeks later. Riley, can we talk? In person. We'd met at a coffee shop, neutral territory. He'd looked older, somehow diminished. I've been reviewing the trust reports, he'd said. Actually reading them this time, not just glancing at the summary. Your analysis is thorough. Professional. Better than Wellington's, honestly. Thank you. I owe you an apology. A real one. He'd paused, stirring his coffee. I underestimated you. Worse, I actively dismissed you. I told myself I was being protective, but really I was being threatened. The idea that you might be better at this than me challenged everything I'd built my identity around. You built your identity around inherited wealth and paid management, I'd said quietly. That's not the same as building anything. He'd flinched but nodded. You're right. I inherited money and pretended that made me an investor. You actually became one. And instead of celebrating that, instead of being proud, I tried to keep you in a box labeled daughter, not investor. That was wrong. Yes, it was. Can you forgive me? I'd thought about it. 30 years of dismissal. Years of being excluded, patronized, told to stick to savings accounts. Years of proving myself in private while being minimized in public. I can forgive you, I'd said finally. But things are different now. I'm not asking for permission anymore. I'm not seeking approval. I'm managing the trust whether you stay in or sell out, and I'm making decisions based on what's best for the portfolio, not what makes you comfortable. I understand. For what it's worth, Bob and I decided not to sell. Your returns are too good to walk away from. We're staying in. Smart decision. We'd like to learn though. If you're willing to teach. Actually learn this time, not just pretend we understand while paying others to do the work. I'd smiled slightly. I can do that. But it means acknowledging you don't know as much as you thought you did. After this year? That's pretty obvious. He paused. I'm proud of you, Riley. I should have said that years ago. I'm proud of who you've become, what you've built, how smart you are. I'm sorry I made you prove it before I could see it. Thank you, Dad. That means something. The trust's performance had continued to excel. By the end of the second year under my management, we'd grown from $40 million to $82 million. My personal portfolio had reached $19 million. Combined, I was managing over $100 million in assets. The annual meeting this year was different. Dad had asked me to lead it officially. You're the majority shareholder and the portfolio manager. It's your meeting. So I'd sat at the head of the table, Grandpa's old seat, and presented the annual report. Returns strategy outlook. Dad, Uncle Bob, Uncle Tom, Marcus, and Derek had listened attentively, asked intelligent questions, and actually engaged with the material. One more thing, I'd said at the end. I'm proposing we open trust participation to all family members regardless of gender. The women in this family deserve the same financial education and opportunity we're discussing here. Agreed, Uncle Tom had said immediately. Marcus and Derek had nodded. Dad had looked at Uncle Bob. Fine, Uncle Bob had said grudgingly. Though I suspect most of them will outperform us too. Probably, I'd agreed. The Anderson women have been underestimated as long as I have. Imagine what they'll do with actual opportunity. After the meeting, as everyone was leaving, Dad had pulled me aside. Your grandfather would have been proud of you, he'd said quietly. He built this trust hoping his descendants would grow it, protect it, strengthen it. You're the first one who actually has. Grandpa never excluded women from finance, I'd pointed out. That was your generation's innovation. He'd smiled ruefully. Fair point. We improved nothing and added prejudice. Not our best work. But you're learning. That counts for something. Thanks to you. For being patient with us. For being better than we deserved. I'd driven home that evening thinking about the journey. From the excluded daughter in the corner to the majority shareholder at the head of the table. From stick to savings accounts to managing $100 million. From being dismissed as incapable to proving I was the most capable investor in the family. The irony was perfect. The men who'd insisted investing was too complex for women had handed control to a woman who'd built wealth independently while they'd inherited and stagnated. They'd said I'd never own stocks. I owned their entire portfolio. They'd said to leave it to professionals. I'd become the professional. They'd said I didn't have the analytical mindset. I had the only analytical mindset in the room. And now finally they were listening. Not because they'd become enlightened. Not because they'd overcome their prejudices through moral growth. But because I'd made it impossible to ignore the results. I'd taken their money, grown it by double, and forced them to confront the reality that they'd been wrong about me from the beginning. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's simply being undeniably, measurably, mathematically better than the people who dismissed you. It's watching them realize their prejudice cost them money, opportunity, and respect. It's making them say, "Teach me," after decades of telling you that you had nothing to learn. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. Your cousin Jenna wants to talk about investing. I told her you're the expert in the family now. Proud of you, sweetheart. I smiled and typed back, happy to help. About time the Anderson women learned what the men should have been teaching all along. Because that was the real victory. Not just proving the men wrong, but opening the door for the next generation of women who wouldn't have to fight as hard, wouldn't have to prove themselves as thoroughly, wouldn't have to build empires in secret just to be taken seriously. I'd started with $3,000 in skepticism. I'd ended with $100 million in respect. And the family that said I'd never own stocks now depended on me to manage theirs. The professionals had been dismissed. The amateur had become the expert. And the daughter they'd underestimated was now the one they called when they needed actual financial advice. Stick to savings accounts, they'd said. I'd stuck to excellence instead. Turns out that worked better.